Namaste, Sri Aurobindo Namaha. We are continuing with our set of talks for the India Inspires Foundation, and we are very happy to be able to address a number of topics on a number of different subjects. Our current talk is going to be on the left and right in India, even perhaps the myth of the left and right in India. So it has important political as well as cultural implications. In the dialogue between civilizations, there is often this problem of languages, particularly when a colonized country has its teachings and its terminologies dominated by the colonizer. So what happened was a lot of these terms in the native languages of India, particularly in Sanskrit, became translated and distorted by translation into English. But it has also happened in the reverse way, that certain English terms come into India and gain a very different meaning than they had in the West. And often both people in India and people in the West do not realize that the terms have a different meaning and mean different things. The West has its own specific political parlance, language, and terminology. We have terms communist, socialist, fascist, capitalist, democracy, and then we have these divisions of political policy: left, right, center, far left, fanatical left, far right, and so on. And these things have a certain meaning. They've also changed somewhat in meaning over time, and they have a rather different meaning and application in the Indian context. So let's first of all put this into perspective. Now, of course, we had the colonial rule over Asia. Okay. Now, when the colonial powers like the British took over India, they did not view themselves as colonizers or oppressors. They viewed themselves as liberators and promoters of a higher civilization. So they felt they were liberal people, and the traditional cultures, the Hindus, the Chinese, were backward people following oppressive laws, having out-of-date social customs, superstitions, unscientific practices, and they also felt that Christianity was a much more spiritual, sensitive, and humanistic religion than the Buddhist, the Hindu practices that people were following. Now, from the standpoint of the people ruled by the colonial rulers were military, they were police-oriented, they were oppressors, and they were denying human rights, they were denying cultural expression, they were promoting conversion, they were promoting cultural domination, even economic domination and exploitation. Then what happened in 19th century Europe is, besides the dominant culture, which was all at that time the colonial rulers, you also had the counterculture and those protesting against the dominant governments. This movement started earlier, particularly in the 18th century, France, even United States, where there was the idea of republican human rights, going against the church, going against the rule of kings, promoting democracy. So you had this arising of a liberal leftist or alternative tradition in the West. They were still based in Western culture, but many of these more liberal groups and leftist groups protested against the colonial rule and had some sympathy with the colonized people. And then a number of the people, the colonized people, they sent their children to the West for education, or the educational institutions that had developed based upon Western influence, like the British system in India. Their children went there. And this generation, these people then became exposed also to the Western alternative tradition that protested or was against the colonial rulers and the rule of the kings and all of that. And what happened in Europe then in the 19th century, we had the arising of the far left, for example, the communists. And so a lot of the younger people, students from India, China, Asia, when they adapted Western education, they had found sympathy with and took upon these leftist ideologies and to a great extent joined them. And there was a commonality with them for promoting the independence of the colonized countries. And this happened all throughout Asia. Then, of course, in the early 20th century, we had the communists take over Russia and the Russian Empire, and bit by bit other countries. And then these communist leftist countries were also sympathetic to and even promoted independence and revolutionary movements in other countries. Most notable was China, in which the communist Chinese became the dominant force, even though there were earlier liberal socialist groups, and also even to some extent in India. So essentially, the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, particularly the modern educated intellectuals in Asia, became enamored with, became products of, educated by the European left. This goes also to Nehru himself, who was dominated by the Fabian socialist thought and was part of the Fabian socialist movement in Great Britain. Fabian socialists belonged to the far left. Some of them became spies for the Russians in World War II and joined the communists. So they were essentially an alternative movement. They perceived themselves as against the British establishment. But what happened then, these leftist groups in their own countries went against their own cultures. So the Chinese communists not only rejected the British and the French and the Americans as right-wing or fascist, they also went against the Chinese emperor, the Chinese native culture, as conservative, oppressive, right-wing, and fascist. The same thing happened in the Indian context. The Indian leftists that were willing to join the independence movement also became anti-Hindu, and they rejected the traditional culture of India as backward. In other words, the leftist leaders who were pro-independence still continued the colonial cultural mindset of denigrating and rejecting their own native culture. So when these leftist, Western-educated leftists took power, they often shut down, limited, or even oppressed their own cultures. The most notable was the Cultural Revolution in China. I think it was from 1966 to 1976, where Mao shut down almost all the traditional learning in the country. Buddhist monasteries were destroyed in great numbers. Universities were shut down. Traditional learning was shut down. Many traditional books were burned. It's one of the biggest book burnings in the history of the world. The communists in Russia, even though Russia was originally a European power, underwent a similar thing. They not only threw out the Tsar, they threw out a lot of the literature, the art, and the music of the Russian culture. So too in India, the leftist, communist, and Nehruvian socialists rejected Hindu thought. They were against Vedas and Upanishads. They repeated the same criticism of India and Hindu thought that the British colonial masters did and that the Christian missionaries held. So in terms of ideas, even though these leftist leaders were pro-independence for these countries at a political level, they continued the same intellectual slavery and dependency, and in many respects they continued the same educational institutions and even media, newspapers approach to politics that the colonial rulers had. That's why I call them cultural colonialists. Culturally speaking, they would still reject the traditional Hindu culture, but they would follow the West. I think many years ago, I think his name was Sadashiv Dange. He was one of the old communist leaders. I met him during the last year or two of his life. I had some interesting discussions with him. And he knew all about Voltaire and Goethe and Shakespeare and all of these Western thinkers. You asked him about Upanishads and Vedas, he didn't know anything. Now, he prided himself in not knowing about them. But he had one lament. His wife was still a great follower of the Bhagavad Gita, read it every day, and everything he had done to turn her away from the Gita had failed. Today, you see a number of these literary figures in India giving back their awards to protest the current government. Current government is giving more support to the traditional culture. Now, if we look at these literary figures, you'll find that they know Western literature very well. They even try to imitate Shakespeare or modern Western writers, but almost none of them know Sanskrit. The Kavya literature they don't study. Kalidas they certainly would not read. Philosophically, they prefer Marx or the neo-Marxist thought, or even someone like Wendy Doniger, but they would not read a Sri Aurobindo, or even Vivekananda, or even much less the older Vedas and Upanishads. In fact, when I remember another time, this was also about 20 years ago, I was asked to give a talk. I think it was one of these main societies in Mumbai. The name is escaping me. But it was run by the leftists. And of course, I was put there to give them a hard time. So what I said in my talk was that compared to the great rishis, Patanjali and Krishna and Shankara, that the Western thinkers like Marx have very little minds. Their minds are very small because they don't understand states of consciousness, higher awareness. They're only social, political, and outer views. And one of the people came to me after my talk and was very upset. He says, you know, in India you cannot criticize Karl Marx. Anybody you can criticize, but not him, because these people are very devoted to him, and if you say anything against him, they will turn against you and they will attack you. And they will criticize us for even inviting you to this particular event. So I realized what was going on at that time. So what the left has done as cultural colonialists, they are turning the minds of the youth and the intellectuals against India's own culture. Reject the Vedas, reject the Upanishads. They would say this is all Hindu, this is all pro-caste, this is all Brahmin domination, this is fascist, this is oppressive, this denigrates women. In other words, using all the terminology of the Western left to attack the Hindu tradition and to turn people against it. So in that regard, they're following the same mentality as Macaulay. They're following the same mentality as the Christian missionaries, and they're having the same effect, except what they're promoting is their Western leftist culture rather than some of these other groups. And then recently, they've also taken to promote a lot of the Western hedonistic culture. I was asked by one of the Indian newspaper groups, India Today, to write some articles for them. They have an opinion column called Daily O. So I said, okay, I'll write some things. They said to me, there's very few people writing from what they said, the right, the Hindu right. So we need some people speaking from that. So I wrote some articles for them. Actually, they were fairly well received. But then I looked at their site. They had so many articles promoting sexual freedom in all of its forms. They had so many articles promoting eating of meat and beef eating as something liberal, modern, and progressive. Now, this is where a very interesting point comes in. You know, I live in the United States, and I have to tell you, I was a very staunch leftist when I was younger. I was very active in the anti-war movement in the United States and led a number of protests. I belonged to the Students for a Democratic Society, and which is almost more far left at that particular time. And I'm no longer with those groups for various reasons, but I follow certain social political views. And it's interesting, the social political views I follow in America will place me on the left or the far left. And these social political views include promoting vegetarianism. That's a left-wing agenda in the United States. It's a right-wing agenda in India. Promoting animal protection, left-wing agenda in the United States, right-wing agenda in India. In fact, left-wing people in the United States do not eat beef and hamburgers. They think that's cowboy. They think that's right-wing. You know, that's what the Texans do. You know, that's what George Bush and company does. Ecology. I've promoted the ecology. That's also regarded as the left-wing agenda and supported by people like Al Gore, who was the vice president and almost president of the United States. Also, we're very liberal on women's issues too, and promoting the feminine idea of divinity, Devi, Shakti, Divine Mother, Hindu gods and goddesses. That's also considered to be a left-wing agenda in the United States. It's, of course, right-wing in India. In the United States, we have a large Hindu-American community that supports a similar range of issues. 80% vote for Obama. They vote very strongly on the left. And also people like Obama and Hillary Clinton offer dinners for them and seek their donations because they know they can be a very helpful group. In America, one of my friends is also Deepak Chopra, and he's very much involved with the Western media. He's a friend of Obama and company. And he teaches Veda, Ayurveda, Vedanta, mantra, meditation. He is considered to be a figure of the far left. And in India, in the West, yoga is taken up by the people on the left, not by the people on the right. Meditation, Buddhism are much more taken up by people on the left, not the people on the right. And so left has a different meaning in the United States than it has in India. And generally in America, there is in the political discourse a distinction between leftist and the left liberal or the left center. Okay, what do we mean here? The leftists to them are the old left, which is socialist and communist, which reject democracy or reject capitalism. The American left is not that. So the left liberal are liberal capitalist, and they represent left center, not the far left. So it's curious that in the American context, I'm considered to belong to the left. In the Indian context, I've not only been called right-wing, I've been called fascist. And this is for a long time. As much as almost 20 years ago, there was an Indian weekly called The Week that in one article referred to me as the well-known fascist William Frawley. This was very funny because if I'm well known, they should at least know my name. Instead, you can see the propaganda involved. And also in the West, figures like Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Yogananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi are considered to be more liberal, spiritual figures. They would generally be put more, if you put them in a political perspective, more on the right. In America, right wing is the Christian fundamentalist. It is a lot of the military groups and some of the corporate groups, although there are some of these people relative to the left as well. So even many years ago, I wrote an article in one of my books. I think it was in the book, what was it, Hinduism and Clash of Civilizations, or maybe Awakened Bharat. I think Hinduism and Clash of Civilizations. Myth of the Hindu right. That a lot of the things that would be called the right in India would not be considered right-wing in the United States. And even if we look at so-called right-wing Hindu groups like RSS, you will find cow protection, protection of villages, and also a lot of basically socialist agenda, government policies for the poor. Those kinds of socialist agendas are actually more left in America than are the left-center policies. America has welfare but doesn't have the kind of reservations that you have in India, that it was considered to be far left items that are not there in the United States. I knew K.S. Sudarshan very well, who was the head of the RSS for many years. He was one of the most gentle person I had ever known, extremely gentle person. He was always quoting Mahatma Gandhi. It's interesting to note that Gandhi has been taken, we'll talk about him later, Gandhi has become almost an icon of the left in India. Actually, his views are more on the right. We'll discuss that later. But it's interesting that the most Gandhian organization in India today is RSS. Reason for that is they're promoting the protection of the villages, protection of the cows, and the very gentle approach. And they're also very tolerant of a lot of different religious and cultural groups. The Swadeshi economics, they call themselves Gandhian economics. I don't agree with them entirely, by the way. That is another issue. But my point here is how this terminology has been warped and distorted. So say Sudarshan, when he came to America, he talked to the Native Americans about protecting their native traditions. Protecting Native American traditions is an agenda of the left in America. It's not an agenda of the right. Projecting native traditions throughout the world is an agenda of the European left. The European left is supporting pagan traditions and pagan revivalism in Europe. But in India, the left is against the revival of any native tradition, specifically the Hindu, but even Buddhist traditions, even Adivasi traditions, they do not want to see those come up. They are instead promoting more the Western political, older type Marxist, atheist agendas. So in other words, the terminology has become extremely distorted, and left and right in India bear very little resemblance, or they have major differences from left and right in Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, the leftists in America don't always know that. So when Romila Thapar, who is a communist, goes to American universities, she introduces herself as a liberal humanist. She never mentions the fact she's a Marxist or a communist. She tries to create sympathy with the so-called liberals in America. And then say, we're leftists, these people belong to the right. And then what do? They play up the image of Hindus as fascist. And what do? They show Hindus with swastikas. They show RSS with dandas, khaki shorts. They say these are paramilitary organizations. Paramilitary organizations have AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades. They hijack airplanes. If you want to see what religious intolerance does, let's look at the Middle East. It's very interesting. In India today, they're saying, great national tragedy that beef eating is being restricted. That's a national tragedy. It's a loss of your freedom. It's a sign of impending fascism and cultural doom. Let's look at Syria. There are no Hindus there. There are no Hindus in the Middle East. In the Middle East, where there's no Hindus, there's much more violence than in India, where Hindus are dominant. There's much more violence in Pakistan, where Hindus are a minority. We have friends who are major Hindu leaders in Pakistan. Hindus in Pakistan, this is a fact, cannot own land. They cannot register their marriages. Their girls can be abducted from them almost any time from the time they reach puberty, and it is very difficult to get them back. If they try to get them back, they have to pay large ransom sums, or they put their own lives at risk. You have these literary figures giving up their awards because India has become intolerant. Has one of them ever said one word about the Hindus in Pakistan? Nothing. Even Hindus in Bangladesh are suffering much more. I'm not saying there's no oppression or there's no inequality in India for various reasons, but there is also what I call the hypocrisy of the left, where they choose certain human rights issues that attack Hindus, and they ignore human rights issues in which Hindus are attacked or in which other religious groups are active. This hypocrisy is quite obvious, but the media in India covers it over. How many articles have there been about restriction of beef eating in India? How many articles have there been about how Hindus are oppressed in Pakistan? Or we have a number of Hindu leaders have been murdered in India over the years, and there's never a protest. Even they say, oh, it doesn't matter, they were a political leader, they did it. And then look at the other hypocrisy of the press in India. Whenever violence occurs, you'll notice that the religious identity of the perpetrator of the violence is only mentioned if they're Hindus. The religious identity of the victims of violence is only identified if they're Muslims. Not only, always. If you rob from a Hindu, it's a regular crime. If a Muslim is robbed, it's an attack on Islam. Because the left in India is trying to divide the country and inflame the Muslims against the Hindus because they've been a reliable vote bank. This type of behavior always increases before election time. And that is one reason why we're having a lot of these episodes going on in India today. But all throughout the world, the left is being pro-ecology and saying, let's reduce beef consumption. In India, it's a human right. Eating beef is a human right. It's a liberal agenda, and all these different factors involved. What then are right-wing Hindus? A right-wing Hindu would have nothing in common with a right-wing Republican in the United States. So there's no common. The left wing will have something in common in the sense that you have Marxists in the United States in a few places, not very many. So what does the right-wing Hindu have in common with the right in Europe and other countries? Not so much. Ideologically, not so much. There are certain issues of being worried about immigration, wanting to promote a more capitalist economy. And it's interesting to note that up to a few years ago, there was not one major journalist in India that would refer to himself as right-wing. The only one we really have today is really, of course, Swapan Dasgupta. And he, in that sense, is speaking of right-wing in the sense of the intellectual freedom and rationality and rejection of the politics, the division, the hypocrisy of the left. Now in India you have the phenomenon of leftist leaders basically sermonizing about human rights, right? Whether it's Brenda Carrot or Sitaram Yechury or even their colleagues in NDTV and some of these other places. What is the record of human rights in socialist and communist countries? Stalin was one of the worst dictators in history. And people forget, in 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler and joined Hitler in the invasion and destruction and rule of Poland. He was an ally of Hitler, and when the Soviets conquered Poland, There's this very famous massacre. They executed 25,000 Polish officers. You can find this, it's well known on the internet, because they wanted to control Poland. For 2 years, Stalin was Hitler's ally. He gave Hitler weapons. They had economic connections. It was only because Hitler broke the pact and invaded the Soviet Union that Stalin ceased to be an ally of Adolf Hitler. And after World War II, they never gave Poland any of that land back. None of the land that the Soviets took away from Poland ever went back to Poland. Instead, what they did after World War II is they pushed Poland into Germany. Eastern Germany was added to Poland, so Poland became a larger state, but all the land that the Soviets took was kept by the Soviet countries. Now it's part of Ukraine, it's part of Byelorussian, it's no longer part of Russia proper, but the Soviets were clear allies of the fascists. Sometimes there's an attempt to criticize Savarkar and those people because some people in their groups had said positive things about Germany in the 30s. Who didn't say positive things about Germany in the 30s? Many people did. And what they forget is their own Stalin in the 40s was an ally of Adolf Hitler. The other interesting thing that happened on this particular side and issue was the connection, of course, via India as well. So the very groups that the left calls fascist in India, like RSS or even Hindu Mahasabha, were the very groups that asked the Indians to join the British Army in World War II to fight the Nazis, because the Nazis were a greater danger to humanity. While Mahatma Gandhi, supposedly of the left, we'll talk about that later, started his Quit India movement and actually disrupted the British war efforts to the benefit of Hitler. And yet we label those people, even Sri Aurobindo asked the Indians to join the war against Hitler because Hitler was a greater enemy. The irony is the Indian groups that asked to fight against Hitler are now attacked as far right or fascist, and the ones who didn't are regarded as more progressive. So what happened is this cultural colonialism of the left continued in India, and also under Indira Gandhi. Even under Nehru you had some of that, but under Indira Gandhi, even more specifically, she had an alliance with the communists, and they were to a great extent allowed to write the textbooks in India. Sonia Gandhi brought that alliance back, and she also brought in the communists. They had so many votes to give them. In reward for joining their alliance, they were given the right to rewrite the textbooks in India, which they did. So essentially ICHR and organizations like that, Indian Council of Historical, or Indian Council of Historical Relations, was a proxy of the cultural colonialism of not only the Indian left, but the communist. And most of these people, like Irfan Habib, are communist. Now, I'm not going to say that you should be anti-communist and dismiss anybody outright as because simply they're communist. But I ask you, where in the world have the communists ever been objective, fair, non-politically biased historians, particularly in the history of religion, of course, which they are against, and the dharmic cultures of India? Again, it's not only groups like Hindu Mahasabha or RSS that are called fascists by the left. The communists in China made the Dalai Lama into a fascist. They said Tibetan Buddhism is fascist, Chinese Buddhism is fascist. And what were they doing? They were creating slogans to denigrate these traditions so that people would cease to honor them. Now, a very curious thing has happened in China over the last few decades. In China now, there is a big revival of Confucianist learning, traditional learning, honoring of the ancient poets and painters and artists, and even Buddhism. We had the Dharma Dhamma conference here, along with a lot of Tibetans and other groups. There's some Chinese there. And they said right now, they're having the largest Buddhist conference in the history of the world in China, promoted by, supported by, endorsed by the government of China, which of course the Indian leftists have kowtowed to the Chinese communist for so very long. So the Chinese communist, do you know what the difference between the Chinese communist and the Indian communist has been? Chinese communists were always nationalistic. Indian communists were always anti-nationalistic. So the Chinese are embracing, even though communists, they're embracing and honoring their older traditions. At the same time, the left in India is still criticizing us for trying to bring back study of Vedas, for bringing back more value of Mahabharata and other things into education. Schools in China now have to teach Confucius. That would be the same as if schools in India had to teach Bhagavad Gita or text like that. And yet the Indian left doesn't protest what the Chinese are doing. In Russia, Russia used to be a communist country, as you know. Russia now has gone back to its old learning. Putin is a member of the Orthodox Church, and in the main cathedral in St. Petersburg, also they have one in Moscow, the place where the Tsar used to sit, the president of Russia sits today. They are promoting the older religious, spiritual, philosophical, artistic, musical, cultural traditions of Russia that the communists and the Soviets threw out and oppressed. And yet in India, when we try to bring back something of the Vedic, the Hindu thing, we are attacked as communalist, we are attacked as biased, we are attacked as obscurantist, superstitious, and all the rest. See the hypocrisy. And they don't want in India people to know what is going on in the rest of the world. So the left in India has this cultural agenda to discredit anything Hindu, even if it's astronomy, even if it's even if it's mathematics. All these traditions were connected. Literature, social science, things that even was never particularly religious. As we know, all the dharmic traditions are not faith-based religions like Christianity and Islam. They're not trying to convert the world. They do not consist of dogma and creed. They consist of various ways of knowledge, promoting yoga, meditation, mantra, healing, things that are now, as we say, regarded as more progressive or of the left in the rest of the world. So these cultural leftist colonialists are continuing the denigration of the native culture and the promotion of basically outside values. Promotion of outside values is okay if they're true, if they are of some value or validity. But if they are of not a positive nature, so what we have now is the same cultural colonialists are promoting a lot of hedonism in India, sensationalism, and also again dividing up, criticizing the family, the breaking up the community, going against traditional values in various ways. So what's happening in India, we should not look at as the liberal left defending the society from the intolerant right. See, that is the media scenario they want to put out. It is the intolerant left refusing to accept the fact that they are no longer in power. What they are protesting is not intolerance. I put this on Twitter today. What they are protesting is the loss of government patronage. If you gave them government patronage, they would all take their awards back again tomorrow. And you have to understand the left does not believe in tolerance. The left in India never tolerates any other point of view but their own. They only allow, that's why they've populated every academic institution with their people as much as possible for them. That is why they have in the media demonized anybody who opposes them. Another friend of mine, Kanchan Gupta, is also a great journalist that people would put on the right. Back in the 90s, Sonia Gandhi and company, they tried to cut off his income, they tried to discredit him, they tried to prevent him even from making an income and surviving. They do not tolerate dissent. So these are people who don't represent freedom. They're not saying that dissent, their message is not really that India's become more intolerant. Their message is that they have lost power. And of course we know that how many of them never protested the Sikh riots in 1984. They've never protested what's happened to Hindus in... they won't even, if there's a petition goes around supporting Hindus, Hindu human rights in Pakistan, no leftists in India will sign it. Why? Because they have a colonial mentality. They also believe Hindus shouldn't have human rights. They only follow these, make human rights an issue for their particular people. And now because of Modi's popularity, their goal is more to discredit or demonize Modi, whatever he does. And this is a very interesting phenomenon because when Modi travels to the other countries in the world, he is embraced by the left-center politics. He is embraced by a lot of organizations that the left does not want him to be embraced by, various academic and various cultural things. Now, recently there was a petition against Modi by various academics in the West. And it's interesting, the academics mainly belong to the humanities. They were not scientists. In fact, a counter-proposal by academics in science and business came out that had many more signatures. But when we went down the list of these people, they were almost entirely leftist. Many of them were Indian Marxists who've come, Chatterjee, you know, the Bengalis have taken positions in American academia. And if you read their papers, they're not only attacking Modi in India, they're attacking Obama in the United States. One of these Indian leftists, and I think it was either Harvard or one of the Ivy League schools, maybe it was Yale, has written a book defending Islam, even though she's a communist from India. And she made the statement that the American government is worse than the Islamic State in terms of human rights. America should not criticize the Islamic State for throwing gays off the top of buildings, killing nurses and women teachers, beheading Christians. She didn't use those words, but she said they shouldn't be because America's bombing them. America's instigating them. But why doesn't she go to the Islamic State? She's having a nice, comfortable job in an American university, gaining a good income. She's criticizing the country that she's actually drawing her income from. Why doesn't she go at least back to India? So these people were trying to give the American government the idea that they represent, or even in India, they represent America. But in fact, they are the leftist aspect of the American academia. And there are certain alliances between the left in India and the left in the West, particularly the far left, the Marxist left. Even in Europe, for a long time in England, the Fabian socialist connection continued, and the Indian leftists continued that alliance. And even today, newspapers like The Guardian in UK will blindly attack anything Hindu because of their sympathy with the left. But it's interesting to note that in India, the far left, the communists, they're all very wealthy people. They have big estates. They buy the latest cars. The women get designer clothes. It's not the poverty of the left that they are embracing. And in India, there has been created what I call the socialist elite. And this is in a lot of the IAS officers and the people who have been running the government. They get tremendous benefits from the government. They send their children to study overseas. They get free foreign travel. They get free houses. They even continue in the houses after they're supposed to leave them. These people are protesting because they're going to lose their privileges. And then they protest by saying, oh, we must support the poor. Well, you've been in power for 60, 70 years. The poor have not gone down. What have you done for the poor? You're saying Modi is making India poor. Well, India has been poor under you. You have done every sort of socialist welfare scheme for the poor. You have bought so many votes with your special benefits for the poor. Socialism has never raised up the poor in any country in the world, and it hasn't raised up the poor in India. Only development will raise up the poor, and that requires not simply industry, it requires some high-tech development, better educational system, capitalistic policies. In America, it takes 3 permits to open a restaurant. In Delhi, it takes 67 permits to open a restaurant. And not only that, in America, it's illegal for you to bribe anybody. In India, you can bet that each of these 67 persons is going to be receiving something along the way. Europe, too, has problems. In France, if you start a new business, your tax rate is 63%. So the French entrepreneurs are going to England and the United States. So this has also occurred in other welfare states. So the socialist left has not raised the poor. It always talks about the poor. Indira Gandhi, poor, 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 but the poor remained poor. So I once wrote, I says, the left in India doesn't want to uplift the poor, it wants to keep India poor. Because they feel poor, uneducated people are easier to bribe and easier to get their votes from. You offer them some promise. All these schemes they have, the schemes look very good on paper, but the food, the money actually doesn't come to the poor people. When Modi opened up his banking scheme to have accounts, they were appalled by it, because this was something that they would have liked to have done, but of course, under their case, the money would never have reached the people. All the socialist countries have had a rich socialist elite, and the money never went to the poor. That was the same way in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. That was the same way in every socialist country that you have. So it's very important that India rejects the economics of the left as well as the politics of the left. But to continue with our line of thought, left and right are wrong terms for the Indian context. We need to understand them to some degree, how they're abused, what they mean, how they've been distorted. In India, we need to go back to the idea of dharma. What is dharmic politics? What is the dharmic thing to do? Dharmic values and karma yoga. This is what the Indian context need. To a great extent, Mahatma Gandhi tried to do a lot of that. So I want to talk about Gandhi briefly. And the first thing is, Hindus should stop letting the left own Gandhi. Gandhi was never a figure of the left. Gandhi criticized the communists. He says they're violent people. We cannot support them. They should not be given power. He criticized socialism as hedonistic, as materialistic. He accepted a socialism of helping the poor, but the Western socialist political ideology he rejected. He even criticized Nehru in that respect, tasking him not to adapt these Western materialistic values. We must remember Nehru was never a Gandhian. He never claimed to be a Gandhian. He never claimed to be a religious person. He didn't go to prayer meetings. He honored the left. He called himself agnostic or atheist. He embraced the Fabian socialist. He tried to do the 5-year industrialization models in India. He tried to create these socialist cities. He brought in the same socialist policies, and they were the same failure in India as they were in the rest of the world. Indira Gandhi pushed them further, and her emergency was actually a copy of what had gone on in communist countries and in communist China. That dictatorship of the left is always there. As we say, they're intolerant. So that promotion was always going on. Now there's this idea that Gandhi is a secular person, right? Who would say Gandhi is not a secular person? If you went to America, you will not find one person who calls Gandhi a secular person. Why? The man wears loincloth. He conducts prayers. He talks of spirituality. His favorite book is the Bhagavad Gita. He lives by donation. He doesn't touch money. He would never wear a suit. He fasts. his political weapon. He has no political office of his own. He's obviously a religious figure. If you want to condemn anyone for reusing religion at a political level, the so-called father of the nation was the one who did that. I'm not condemning him for doing that. Why did people honor him? Why didn't he put a suit on if they were just honoring him for his own ideas? If it was just Gandhi the person, he could have worn a suit or anything and he would have talked. He used the image of the Hindu sadhu, the white, the loincloth. He used the behavior of a Hindu sadhu. He was originally a lawyer from South Africa. He was not a Hindu sadhu originally, but he adapted the appearance and the ways. And when people saw Gandhi, they saw in him the Hindu sadhu. They honored him as representing Hindu sadhu. And he spoke of Ram. He spoke of ahimsa. He spoke of cow protection. He even had a lot of sympathy towards caste and Varna. He had a great respect for the Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram, this Chandrasekhar Saraswati, who passed away a few years ago at the age of 100. I was fortunate to meet with him 3 times before he had passed. So that is a very different Gandhi than what they are showing today. He was against abortion. He was very conservative on sexual matters. He was anti-materialistic. He would be appalled by the hedonism and the sexuality you see all throughout the Indian media and the Indian newspapers today, even those that have issues and honoring of Gandhi, particularly on the Gandhi Jayanti. He's not a figure of the left at all. What the left has taken of his is a little bit of ahimsa and a little bit of honoring all religions. Gandhi said all religion should be respected. In India, all religion should be respected except Hinduism. For example, as we said, when one person is killed by beef eating, that is not a good thing. The person is identified as a Hindu. When we have all this violence in the Middle East and in Pakistan, the Indian media will not call any of these people Muslims. They don't call Al-Qaeda Muslims. They don't call Islamic State Muslims. People are doing much more heinous crimes, are not identified by their religion. In fact, we're told they're not true Muslims. They're terrorists. They're distorters of Islam. But in India, if some violence is going on, it is a Hindu. And it was never said as someone distorting Hinduism. It's given the impression that these are mainstream Hindu organizations that are doing it. Whereas in the Middle East, people who run whole governments in the name of Islam are regarded as not being Islamic and not representing Islam by people in the West and in India who themselves are not Muslims in any case to begin with. Gandhi also had his Hindu Swaraj. He used terminology like that, Ram Raja. There are some issues Hindus can have with Gandhi. I'm not going to go into those, but I think we have to understand his image and his role and the positive side and the fact that he did not endorse the left. And the left talks about ahimsa, but they don't believe in it. Indian Marxists talk about ahimsa relative to Hindus. They never criticize Muslims for violence, and they never criticize the left for violence. So they have Che Guevara, who murdered many people and promoted violent revolution. The left in India doesn't follow ahimsa. They believe in violent revolution. They even support the Maoists. Some of them directly supported the Maoists. A few went against them. So when they talk of ahimsa and tolerance of religion, in the 20th century, who destroyed the most churches, temples, and mosques in the world? Communists. In Russia, they destroyed numerous mosques, not only, and some churches as well. In the Chinese Buddhists, they destroyed many temples and many mosques. In fact, there's essentially only one country in the world today in which Islam is being directly attacked or oppressed and even limited in terms of its religious practice, that is China. Yet the Indian left will not criticize China. So it's important for us to understand that the causes and issues that the left is raising are not issues that itself has supported. It is the Hindu tradition that is the most tolerant in terms of accepting religions and spiritual teachings. And yet, in the Indian media, it's portrayed as the most intolerant of the groups. There's no Hindu history of invading other countries, forcible conversion. Even Shivaji, when he was fighting against the Mughals, he never attacked Islam, he never destroyed any mosques, and he made sure that people would respect and honor the Quran or the holy books of other cultures. There was not this attitude. So in other words, there has been this media-based distortion, and what we see, the left in India is what I call anti-Hindu and cultural colonialist, and also the old left. They're trying to continue the socialist, communist mentality that was largely rejected in the 20th century in the rest of the world. So we need a more dharmic approach to the political realm. We need a sense of karma yoga. The problem is that politics tends to be adharmic, because particularly modern politics, because it's based upon control, domination, money, and power. Bringing dharma into politics is a very difficult thing, but it's still something that needs to be done. And it would be very important if our political leaders would honor dharma more. That doesn't just mean going to temples, it also means leading austere or simple lives. How many Congress people live like Gandhi? Does anyone in the Gandhi dynasty live like Mahatma Gandhi? What do? They take regular vacations in UK because life in India and work in India is too stressful for them to do. So karma yoga and dharmic values has to be brought back into the political class. Now, when people do that, they may be accused of being Hindu communalists. I have my definition here of secularism and communalism. Communalism is a Hindu vote bank. Secularism is a Muslim vote bank. The left also will play the religious card to its advantage, but it will use the minority religious card. The left in India plays the caste card, or they say they're anti-caste. But yet they're the ones who pioneered caste-based voting and caste-based identity. And in India, there's been that promoting of caste-based identity over national identity. The other thing that India needs is more nationalism, in the sense of more national unity. The country can rise up where there is national unity. This turning of religions against each other, caste against each other, regions of India against each other, this divide and rule policy the British created, Congress took it up, and the left took it up, and they're still trying to promote these regional, don't vote as an Indian, vote according to your caste, vote according to your religion. It was only in this last election that you had a lot of Indians voting as Indians. Now there's an attempt to discredit this sense of national identity. Here you have a prime minister who has raised India on the global stage. India is a great country, do business with India. Where were all the other Indian politicians all these years? They never had such an agenda. In fact, if you went to the United States and asked people, who are some of the leaders of India? They only say Gandhi and Nehru. They didn't know anybody after that. Of course, we had the prime minister who was missing in action, and we had a shadow prime minister who could not be a state representative because she didn't hold any official political office. So the cause of India was not taken up. Now, the cause of India was taken up by the diaspora, by the India immigrants in America. And again, the great majority of these are also Hindu. Of course, the majority of Indians are, but even in the high-tech world, the majority is a little bit more because of the emphasis more on that in the educational system. But those Hindu Americans, who I know quite well, also want to see the cause of India coming up. And they feel it's quite odd that when India is coming into the global stage as an economic player, people in India are pulling down the country not on economic issues but on cultural issues, saying there's more intolerance today. There have been communal riots throughout India since the independence period. You have as many in Congress and non-BJP ruled states as in other states. You have had intolerance. For example, why didn't any of these writers give up their awards when Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was banned in India? India was the first country in the world to ban it. They didn't even protest. No protest was even given. Taslima Nasreen, her books were banned in Bengal and in parts of India and also Bangladesh. She wrote the communist writers in Bangladesh. Not only did they not support her, they wrote in favor of the banning of her book. See, these are people who are now saying that freedom of expression is under play, is being questioned in India. Certain books against the Gandhi dynasty were banned in India. That has been going on for some time. And they say, oh, Hindus are banning books. This Da Vinci Code of Dan Brown was banned in certain states of India for the benefit of the minority religious groups. And actually, more books have been banned in India for minority religious sentiments than for majority religious sentiments. And in some instances, like Wendy Donegan, her book was not banned. It was simply withdrawn in a court case, and yet it is pretended, or it is said by the media, that the book was banned. And again, in communist countries throughout history, books were banned, writers were arrested, in some instances they were killed, and we know the intolerance of the left at that particular level. So the left has taken upon this idea of policing morality and representing humanism and human rights in the media, but their own history shows that they have been one of the main enemies of tolerance and human rights throughout more than 100-year history of their rule and domination in India and the rest of the world. We also have the case where the left is protesting against this corruption and divisive attitudes among the so-called Hindu right. And yet these same leaders have an alliance with Lalu Prasad Yadav, who is a convicted criminal. He was convicted of it was a huge scam, loss of money, and yet sitting on stage with him is secular. Whereas sharing the dice with Hindu leaders trying to promote economic development in the country is considered to be bad. Or they're attacking certain people like Sushma Swaraj. There's not even a court case against her, and claiming she's guilty. And someone they take stage with someone who is actually convicted of a crime, a bigger crime, and that is secular. That is okay. That is politically all right. In fact, one of them said during the Modi's the government election in 2014 that communalism is the ace card that trumps all the rest. Whatever a candidate may say or have done, if he is anti-communal, you should vote for him regardless of whatever else is there, even if he's Lalu Prasad Yadav. Whereas if a person represents a party we call communal, whatever else, however honest, however much they have done for the country, they should be rejected on that principle alone. Meaning that India should be ruled by a certain mentality that has not yet raised the country after decades of rule, and another group should not be given a chance to do so. So there needs to be a new looking at the social, political situation in India from the eyes of Dharma, honoring Dharmacharyas and even Dharmic teachers. They don't necessarily just have to be Hindus or Buddhists. Anyone who lives a Dharmic life we can do that, rather than honoring the type of people that we do, honoring the dharmic tradition of the country. Why is it that the intellectuals in India don't study the dharmic teachings of India? They don't even honor Lord Buddha. Nalanda University has been created and no Buddhism is being taught there. In fact, for all these years they managed to have 50 students as a university that was designed to promote traditional dharmic culture of India. That's one of the reasons why this Sanchi University has come into being, to give the Buddhists an actual place to represent themselves. And we also saw at this Sanchi event something very interesting. The Buddhists of the Tibetans, the Buddhists in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, are all very happy to share the stage with the Hindus. They are all happy to honor a common dharma. I don't know how many of you were there for the speech of Lama Samten at one of the plenary sessions that we had. He's one of the main teachers under the Dalai Lama, and he was speaking of the commonality of our dharmas. Even Dalai Lama says Hindus and Buddhists are twin brothers. And he said the basic point: we share the same values and practices. We have slightly different philosophies, but we honor diversity in philosophy anyway. It is not a problem. We should work together. So the same Buddhist groups are also under siege as the Hindus are. And we are now finding that the Buddhists are coming to the Hindus for some degree of protection, because in countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, the Buddhists are under siege. Now, I know you see stories that they say that the Buddhists are oppressing the Muslims, but I think we have to watch those stories with some questions. I'm not saying that they're necessarily wrong, but I also know from talking to certain Buddhist leaders that refugees from Bangladesh come in, take over parts of their communities, and claim to have been indigenous people. When they're pushed out, then the Buddhists are blamed. Now, I will also say there are extreme reaction in Hindu and Buddhist groups where people may become violent in dealing with such things, and I think that is something we should not accept. But at the same time, we cannot condemn people for being honest or truthful, or rejecting these type of movements of people and denigration of traditional ideas. So the Buddhists are also been put in the same category by the left as being conservative, fascist, negative, and needing to be removed. In China, we say that's changed in some degree, but the Chinese are also using Buddhism to promote Chinese nationalism and Chinese control of Asia. There is also a political agenda in that context. Karma Yoga, people working in the political field should also embrace lives of simplicity, austerity, truthfulness, some yoga, some sadhana. Even in India, yoga is attacked as right-wing, even though in the West, again, it's the liberal people who practice the yoga, not the conservative right-wing people. Meditation, introspection, and honoring of India's dharmic cultural values, and a willingness to help revive India's authentic dharmic traditions. There's much beautiful wisdom in all the Shastras. You might find some things that are no longer relevant. You can criticize Manu Samhita in the 21st century. It's more than 2,000 years old. Compare it to any law code of 2,000 years ago, you'll find it is extremely liberal. And even now it has a spiritual dimension that you will not find in any of the law codes of the world. So put these things in their proper context. Bring a respect for dharmic teachings and traditions into the educational system as well as the political system. That's not just a matter of saying the Bhagavad Gita is 5,000 years old. It's also a matter of respecting the values that the Gita teaches, which includes not only tolerance, includes an inner view of life where our goal is not simply the accumulation of wealth, but the development of awareness, consciousness, and the achievement of moksha. India has had the greatest pursuit of freedom of any culture in the world, but it has properly understood freedom as freedom of the spirit. Material freedom is always limited. Freedom to get what you want is an illusion because desire is something that doesn't come from you. It's the propaganda, it's the advertisement that says you need that car, you have no biological need. It's nice to have a better looking car, that is another thing. But the desires are artificial. The freedom to get what you want is the freedom to be a slave to the desires of the external world. True freedom is freedom of consciousness, freedom of the spirit, which arises through dharmic practices, dharmic teachings, and dharmic values. So under this attempt to, this cultural colonialism and this promotion of the leftist ideals, we have an attack on Dharma. We have an attempt to reject Dharma and to alienate Indians from understanding and respecting their dharmic traditions. So we need to move away from the politics of the left and the right to the politics and the spirituality and the culture of Dharma, and to have an inner honoring of Dharma and dharmic teachers to also help keep the political class in line. The political class now is into alcohol and meat and all these other things as an expression of freedom. That's an expression of attachment to the material world. We need to bring back that karma yoga model and that dharmic way of life, not only for India but for any country to flourish today, particularly in this ecological age. So with those words, I will conclude this particular talk, and again emphasize we can have social political differences. We may not like one leader or another, one party or another, but let's bring back karma yoga and dharmic values in any case.